Every gaming generation has those great aspects that define them, whether it be the console's release, the competition that transpires, or the various trends and advancements in technology, and of course the games themselves. Seeing the vertical leaps and descents accumulating from this medium over the years is what has propelled it into the multi-billion-dollar industry that it is today. But the generation, I would say, that perfectly encapsulated what this industry is and could be at its peak is no doubt the 7th generation of gaming. The 7th gen era of gaming was where gaming peaked. It was in that sweet spot of not being too mainstream, but also being popular enough to warrant master appeal than ever. It was the era where gaming felt more mature and cinematic to some, and more creative and interactive than ever for others. Where some genres started to stagnate, and others rose to immaculate popularity. Where graphics became more realistic, and damn near every game, especially military shooters, had that damn piss yellow and brown blooming color palette, for some reason. I guess making your game look like actual piss and feces is more realistic. The rise of console online play and the conception of what we deem as modern DLC, to the rise and then quickly fall of the co-op shooter, to the newfound competition of Sony and Microsoft, and gimmicky motion controls that other companies tried to imitate but miserably failed. Well, I guess the Kinect did do pretty decent, but ruined an otherwise great console for half a decade. When the Xbox 360 was first unveiled, I remember being so hyped for it. It looked next level compared to the original Xbox. Then the PS3 came around, and even the Wii to a lesser extent due to its motion control gimmick that got old pretty fast. Just comparing the console designs of the original Xbox, that fat ass tank of a console, to the 360, something more sleeker, though maybe not as cool looking. Hell, the real juggernaut console design of this generation was the original PS3, the one with the PlayStation 2 compatibility that Sony took out in later iterations for no reason. Well, I'm sure there was a reason, probably not a good one. One of the most defining aspects of this era of gaming was the entrance into online gaming. You see, while previous console generations dabbled with online capability, albeit very limited, and not really achieving huge success outside of Halo on the Xbox, this era brought PC-level online multiplayer to consoles for the very first time. It was crazy going from playing COD on the PS2, where you need a bunch of cords and ethernet cables or fucking online startup discs for some games, to simply connecting to a router and you're good. The leap in technology honestly played a huge part in video games becoming more mainstream. The stigma, the negative connotations of gaming, while still there, definitely started to evaporate little by little during this era, and coincides with just how mainstream it is now. Just grand things like having a digital store to buy games and apps inside the console was just always crazy to me at the time. Things like DLC, map packs, expansion packs, all trademarks and staples of classic PC games, you know, before shit hit the fan, before every game and their mother included a pre-release season pass. Like, why the fuck do single player games have season passes? Seriously, never understood that. And if you want to talk about trends, this is also the era where co-op really hit their stride. This is the era where every company took the design of single player games and made it co-op, and it was brilliant. From Gears of War to Army of Two, to would-be stealth games like Splinter Cell, to survival horror turned action games like RE5 and Fear 3. If you had a sibling or relative like I did, this was truly the golden age for split-screen co-op games. This is definitely one of the highlights of this era, where Xbox got to truly shine, with its exclusives like Gears of War 2, Halo 3, Left 4 Dead 2, Lost Planet 2, Unreal Tournament 3, Fable 2. Online multiplayer and co-op had never been funner in console. Microsoft were truly in their element during these days, unlike now. Like, there were co-op games before, and maybe even co-op shooters, but this was a grand time period where games were literally made to be played this way, to get the full experience at least. Like how a lot of modern games are made to be online only and waste your time and spend cash on meaningless shit, this was a trend in a similar vein, though obviously less predatory. This was the golden standard for co-op shooters and co-op games, the best era in fact before the mainstream appeal of it all but dwindled, in favor of more egregious forms of gameplay, let's say. Sure, co-op games still exist, but they're nowhere near as prevalent as they used to be during the 7th gen of gaming, which was the era essentially defined by these types of games, and they were defined well as most of these games hold up, with some being timeless works of art like Left 4 Dead 2. Shooters were at their prime. This era of shooters was the best. Before the genre was seemingly dominated by COD, there was a lot more variety. The best of Call of Duty games released during this time period, from Black Ops 1 to Modern Warfare 2, to games like the original BioShock, Bulletstorm, The Darkness, Rainbow Six. While the previous era was oversaturated with World War II shooters, and you could argue even in the last 10 years, a lot of the best AAA shooters from this time period were far more unique. While most shooters today are mainly played for their multiplayer, this was also during a time where we actually got pretty good single player experiences that most would consider to be as memorable as a video game story could get, from Black Ops Zombies to MW2 to even Spec Ops. And let's be real, we'll never see a comic book video game adaptation like The Darkness again. In fact, any comic book adaptation now would just be DC or Marvel stuff. Well, a Hellboy game was announced this past Game Awards, so maybe I spoke too soon. Though that does bring me into my next point of single player games also being refined in this era. In a modern era where gaming is essentially defined by online connectivity via battle royales, multiplayer shooters, and MMOs, the 7th gen was the last era of refined single player AAA games that weren't cinematic movies. That's a very specific criteria, but it's all too true, I know. Games like Arkham Asylum and Arkham City really showed how fluently a comic character could be adapted into a AAA gaming experience. Same with the hundreds of Spider-Man games that often fluctuated in quality. Honestly, I love the Web of Shadows despite it getting mixed reception from game journals and Spider-Man 3.
Help! Please! Someone! I'm going to die!
Didn't know that game or even movie was hated on until I got online. Games like Demon's Souls, Fable 2, Bioshock Infinite, GTA 4, Dead Space, Fallout 3, the entire Mass Effect trilogy, Red Dead Redemption, Telltale's The Walking Dead, and yes, even The Last of Us 1, showed the true strength of the modern AAA single-player experience, with games with versatile gameplay, unique stories, and aiming to be fun above all. You know, before it became somewhat of a dying breed with oversaturation of similar styles of narrative and gameplay execution, like the many Souls-like games. You had shit like all of the God of War clones like Lords of Shadows or Heavenly Sword or Dante's Inferno. Hell, there was even a cancelled Golden Axe GOW inspired game. Funny how God of War used to be a game copied so much by others, now it's a game derivative of another game. Funny how that works. And of course, it wasn't all great, though it was. This era had its ups and downs. This was the time when a lot of companies, mainly Japanese ones, saw what Capcom was doing in terms of trying to break into a larger Western audience by releasing reboots of games that appealed to us over here, as opposed to over there that appeals to people over here, which led to a slew of mishaps and misfires from plenty of companies trying to imitate Capcom, which did find success with Resident Evil and Lost Planet to a degree. From Bionic Commando to Bomberman Act Zero to the infamous DMC that transcends the game that actually has pretty good gameplay, Ninja Gaiden's 3 more streamlined easy combat, to Konami's many attempts to try to recapture an audience with their Western Silent Hill games. Some of the most divisive games ever made because they're not without their merit, though some would like to pretend they just don't exist. Also, there was the Lords of Shadows Castlevania games. Never really played them, but I heard they weren't that bad like many people claimed back then. And that's not to say this sort of change in direction is a bad thing. I mean, Capcom does continue to strike gold with their recent Resident Evils, even if I'm not personally a huge fan of them compared to the originals. And Monster Hunter World sold record-breaking numbers, but more often than not, things are handled rather poorly. Man, what an interesting time in gaming. This was the era where gaming started to become increasingly mainstream, where the whole video games caused violent tendencies was still perpetuated to a degree, where the likes of esports and indie video games became the standard. And you could argue that this was the era where gaming started to become streamlined in game design as it became more popular with the masses, and things like military multiplayer cover shooters started to take over, the abundance of regenerating health in games, and games copying other games to appeal to certain demographics. DLC and monetization, the baseline of what now corrupts the modern day industry, first got its footing. To bad movie tie-in games, though some were good, some shitty. Shoehorned in motion control gimmicks that outright ruined games like Zelda Twilight Princess and especially Skyward Sword. But at the same time, this was the era of the very first interconnected online scape for console gaming on a mainstream scale, with online of a higher and less monetized quality. From Software's slow rise to the staple that they are today, the rise of the digital market, co-op games, from RPGs to shooters, the indie scene, before it became oversaturated, and cinematic games that actually had unique gameplay, before they also became streamlined and oversaturated. It was definitely the peak of the industry, from the constant innovations and ambitions to the competition, where it felt like each company was really at each other's throats with neither really letting go, especially the 360, which I would consider the best console from this era. I just don't think there'll ever be another era like this again in gaming. The 8th and 9th so far are more or less the same in design and even aesthetic. Hell, the graphical leap between the 6th and 7th gen are so completely insane. Like, look at a late stage PS3 game, and then look at a late stage PS2 game. Then do the same for a PS4 and current PS5 game. Nah, fuck that, just compare GTA San Andreas to GTA 4, and there you go. While the graphical jump was massive for this gen in comparison to the previous one, much the same cannot be said about right now. Sure, Unreal Engine 5 looks even more lifelike than ever, it still doesn't look that much different from Unreal Engine 4, nor does it really matter because gaming has become so mainstream, arguably to its own detriment, stagnating heavily, but that's a story for another day.